Thank you so much, Dr. Joya, for joining us.
Thank you for
To
having me.
start things off, I wanted to kind of set the stage for where we currently are in the trajectory of reproductive rights in the US. I think when the Dobbs decision came down, there was a lot of uncertainty for people about what that would actually mean on the ground. So, can you talk us through what were some of the immediate consequences of the Dobbs decision and what we might expect to see in the landscape of reproductive rights over the next few years?
For sure, and thank you once again so much for having me. So it's important to note that at the time when Dobbs came down, many of us have been expecting it to happen, but not so suddenly, right? Like we've known that there was going to be an attack on reproductive rights, and we knew that there was an opportunity that the Supreme Court was super stacked, and there was an opportunity that they might overturn it. But we weren't prepared for it to happen that quickly. Like we thought it'd be in the fall or in the spring. So our original plan for ground game, we were just starting that up because we know that once the fight went back to the states, so Dobbs is a federal law. And so that protected us across the federation of states, is how I like to think. If you're in Europe or another place, you know, it's like the EU. Here we have a bunch of states that have their own rules and responsibilities. So we need kind of federal oversight, especially for places like Louisiana, where I'm from, or other places in the Deep South, or some places in the Rust Belt that tend to be less progressive and less open to freedom for women, for people of color, from indigenous folks, all kind of people. So we knew that if, since the Supreme Court had been politically aligned with the policies of our previous president for a while and had done things around voting rights, we knew we were up next, that reproductive rights was on the chopping block. And so our strategy was to prepare in the states to prepare to fight back, which usually means lawsuits, because we've been doing this for a long time. Since Roe was passed 50 years ago, there have been over 1,000 laws, literally over 1,000 laws challenging it. So we're not new to this conversation of challenging the law. It's just new that it's totally overturned, that we have to start from scratch and the suddenness that it occurred. So that I was like, we believe is a strategy of the right to do it so quickly, to catch us off guard, for us not to be as prepared. It was before, because if they had kept it as a midterm issue, as it could happen, because it's a politically charged, we were kind of assuming that it would happen after the midterms and it would give them something to talk about during the kind of lead up to the midterms. Overturning it actually caused us all to be in a frenzy. Them to be in a frenzy of what they were going to say for their talking points for running for election, to be in a frenzy trying to figure out how to get to the advocates on the ground. And unfortunately, we cannot untie the link between our Supreme Court that's supposed to be apolitical and the politics of the day. Like they are clearly aligned, they are clearly tied. And if nothing else, you can see this clearly from this decision, right? You can see how it plays out in the different states, which states are currently continue to do the laws. Even my own home state of Louisiana, although we have a Democratic governor, he has from the beginning told us that he was anti-choice. And so although he campaigned saying that he would not overturn abortion in our state, the minute that Roe was overturned, he signed the law banning abortion in the state. And so this really became both a political conversation for folks like me, but for the patients, it became a life or death conversation. I have many friends who are OBGYNs like me who've never performed an elective termination or abortion in their lives. They practice OB and do pap smears and hysterectomies and deliver babies, and they find themselves in the middle of a fight that they never thought they would imagine they would be in. I mean, I have a friend who's a high-risk OBGYN who, in New York City, had a patient transferred to him who had had a fetal demise because the fetus was not viable over a certain amount of age, and the mom got really ill, was in the ICU. So we're making now, states are making doctors' choices for them across many states that have now overturned this law that are interfering with the patient's ability to live. So what we see is people like my friends who've never performed an elective abortion, who might even not even work in that space, who normally care for patients who are having a high-risk pregnancy, now being in the middle of a fight to save women's lives because we have government engaged in the care of women without them having any knowledge of what that even means. When Roe was overturned cannot be extracted from our political conversation. It cannot be extracted from the midterms. That was a political decision. The first time you have a leaked opinion. That's not an accident. Like for what we have to be able to do going forward is be honest and forthright when we see things that we know are illogical and know that they are purposeful. I spend a lot of time working on anti-racism, and so I even would normally give people the benefit of the doubt. I would love to believe that people only act these ways when it comes to women's rights or rights for LGBTQ folks because they just don't know. If they just knew better, they would do better. But what this overturning of Roe shows us is that sometimes they know exactly what they're doing. It's a strategy. In fact, it is used to get the outcome that it's creating. And it's not by accident, it's by design. They purposefully released it and then see the response and thought that they could then use it as a tool that they have now completed a task that they promised under the previous administration, which was to overturn Roe. So they did it. So this is now going back to your base and saying, hey, we told y'all we would get a court that would be a anti-choice court, and they did it. And they also then got that court to overturn precedent that's been around for 50 years, which are two things that are unheard of usually in this country.
And you mentioned that while the fight might look a bit different now, it's not a new fight entirely. It's something that's been happening for a long time. And I think that's really helpful framing. And I'm wondering if you can touch on how Black pregnant people in particular have been facing criminalization and surveillance for many years,
Yes.
thinking about things like the criminalization of substance use during pregnancy, surveillance by the child welfare system. Can you talk through that history of criminalization and surveillance among Black pregnant people and Black parents?
For sure. And I just also like to start as an OBGYN to talk about the language of elective in this sense. So as a physician, when we use the word abortion, it's just a medical procedure. So if you have a pregnancy that's not viable, what we perform on you is an abortion. And that's the language we use in our medical records. That's how we document it. So it's usually not elective. So this conversation around Roe is about elective, being able to elect to do things by your choice, not because it's medically indicated, not because the doctor told you to, but you have the personal bodily autonomy. You have the ability as a fully formed human being with a spirit that is born into you when you come into this earth to make decisions about your body. We call that personal bodily autonomy. So since that is something that we don't believe poor people, Black people, indigenous people, rural people should ever have, this country was built on a belief that all of those people, especially Black people, should not be able to control their bodies. They should not be able to elect to do anything. And you see things like policing of Black families when it comes to having a baby. You'll see if the person has a home birth, that instead of it being something that is acknowledged as something great, especially if you're a Black or brown person or indigenous or poor person, the police can show up at your house. We have documentation of still to this day of people being arrested for having a baby at their home, and that is a normal thing in every other country. It is not something that's hyper policed. But even concretely around abortion, as a college student, there was a period in Louisiana where it was briefly illegal to perform abortions in our state. It's always new policies like you'll have to have privileges at a hospital. They create ways to make it difficult. And so clinics will shut down for a while. And so that was a huge burden. I remember me and my friends collecting money on people's credit cards, trying to get somebody to Texas to have a termination who was in college in North Louisiana. So this is not a new conversation for us. We've been having to play states' rights versus human rights in this country since we've never resolved that everybody's fully human, right? So we still are like, no, the states, Texas should get to decide versus the actual human being who's pregnant. So we have not finished litigating states' rights versus human rights in the United States of America. So that's the basic premise. And if you are poor or Black or are not centered, you're more likely to be seen as someone who the government believes its job is to police. So that gets you all a litany of things, which includes being able to have a home birth, but also having your children taken away if you have a substance use. We do things, we have studied it shows that pregnant birthing people will come to the hospital to have a baby, and if you have no prenatal care, they do a urine toxicology screen without telling you that they're going to do it. And then if it comes back positive, they call CPS and take your children. And it's usually marijuana. And we know, especially now that marijuana is being legalized everywhere, there was never really a reason to do that, right? We know that there's a history of this language around crack babies. That was in the 80s. There was a pediatrician who talked about, who who did some data and said that these mothers who are having babies while they're addicted to crack cocaine, these babies are going to be a detriment to society. They're going to be murderers. So this was said in the halls of Congress. And so all these policies are created to harm and penalize people who are addicted to crack cocaine. We see the opposite of that happening now with heroin. We see folks having softer and gentler and kinder policies when it comes to heroin, which I don't want them not to do that. I'm excited that we finally recognize that being pregnant should not mean that you then demonize the person if they have substance use disorder. But man, think about how the communities were decimated. There are mothers still in jail today who were arrested because they were addicted to crack cocaine 30 years ago and pregnant. And those children are now doctors, lawyers, and Indian chiefs because it was never a real truth. It was never going to be that using crack makes you forever a horrible person, that you'll never be able to get a job. Just like if your mother was addicted to heroin today, you're not going to become a horrible person and be a detriment to society. So all this demonization of individuals creates harmful policy, violent policy that causes for us to not be able to survive, much less thrive.
In terms of the consequences of abortion bans, if we think even beyond kind of the impacts on bodily autonomy
Yep.
and the ability to make choices for your own body, when we talk about the health risks
Yeah.
specifically, what are the actual health risks of abortion bans? And might we expect there to be more severe health consequences for Black pregnant people who are seeking abortion?
For sure, and I forgot a big important thing: the abortion pill, right? So, it came out when I was in residency in medical school, and it was a big, huge thing. And I just want to give a little bit of history as to how it came about. There was a medicine that people were taking in Brazil for ulcers, and they would miscarry. And so the people in Brazil realized, oh, we can just use this to a purpose if we want to terminate our pregnancy. We've been doing that with herbs around the world since the beginning of time, right? So this is not a new phenomenon. And what we did, of course, in the United States is take that medicine and then amp it up a bit, right? Charge a lot more money, put it in a fancy box, make a bunch of rules. And so that's why you get the medicine that we currently use for medical abortion. It is now, since the 20 years since I was in medical school, the number one way that people have abortions because it's easy. You can put it in the mail. It decreases the barriers. It's still expensive, but there's a lot of places like Planned Parenthood and the Abortion Fund who will pay for it if you don't have the funding for it. So it's still a really viable option. It is the most pragmatic, and it's less risk of harm. If you take an abortion pill, you are 10 times less likely to die than if you stayed pregnant from the complications of pregnancy. Pregnancy is not a benign phenomenon. As we work on Black maternal health, we know that Black birthing people are 3 to 5 times more likely to die in childbirth. In some places like New York, 8 to 12 times more likely to die in childbirth than their white counterparts. So think about what that means when you take away this pill that you could just take when you miss your period and go about your day. Now we are saying you can't take that, right? And we are making you have a surgical procedure. So that surgical procedure is even more risky than the pill. And these debates that are being had by judges, when we've already had years, we have so much data that shows that the abortion pill is safe. So we are then putting people at risk because we want them to stay pregnant. And when we use language like forced birth, people think we're being hyperbolic. But what else is there besides forced birth? If you were taking the pill off the market, if you're telling people, making laws that say you can't have a termination after 6 weeks, when you know that most people don't even know they've missed a period at 6 weeks, you are forcing them to birth and you are forcing them to put their lives at risk. The way that the choice conversation is framed, either pro-choice or pro-life, makes it appear as if people are making this decision like they're choosing bread versus water. And the conversation when you are pregnant is so much more nuanced. And family members and women and birthing people are making really complicated choices. And I'll give you an example that they don't even think about. Like when you are pregnant, if you get breast cancer, maintaining that pregnancy increases your risk of death from breast cancer. So if you come and you're 35 years old, this is your 5th, you're happily married, and you come in for your appointment and you find out that you're pregnant, and also you get a mammogram result back that says you have breast cancer, and I say to you, hey, you are now, if you maintain this pregnancy, increasing your risk of death. That is a very complicated decision to make. So many people, the majority of patients, hear us say that and say, I think I might terminate. But there are some who say, this is really important for me and I want to maintain that pregnancy. Then there's also a conversation between husbands and wives. I've had husbands to say, I don't want you to maintain this. We already got 4 kids. Why would the government? This is so deeply complicated. I don't even like to. I'm not as their provider. I'm not making that decision for them. What I do is say, "Hey, ma'am. Hey, couple. Hey, people. This is the information. I assume that you are a smart and capable human being, that my job is to provide you with all the risks, and then you determine for yourself what is the best decision for you and your life. And you might eventually regret that decision. But guess what? Many of us regret many things. You might also always appreciate the decision, but not having the information and having it being made by someone else, you're always going to regret that. There's no way to make that be an easier decision, right? Like if I know I have breast cancer and I can't even decide for myself if I want to maintain the pregnancy or not, that's adding stress to me, my marriage, my life, all kind of things. I might not be here to raise the child that I'm now carrying. Like there's a whole litany of things, right? So to act as if the state making the decision takes the regret away is also a false premise as well. And there is a desire, and this is what we don't have another honest conversation about. This is also deeply tied to racial capitalism, right? So there is a desire, a worry about not having enough white babies. Like you can hear it in the language that's out of these legislators are talking about it. And my white female friends are like, I wish they would stay out of my uterus. I'm like, I wish they would stay out of our uteruses altogether, right? So this wanting people to stay pregnant no matter what. There are probably some husbands that would really try to force their wives to make that decision. And that still should be between that husband and that wife. And that should not have anything to do with what the state wants, desires, wishes for their social engineering, for their planning, for their all of those things. And you can see it in the fear. The same folks who are anti-choice are against immigration, right? So it's very much the same population that's against voting rights. It overlays on top. And there's a fear of of people having control over their own bodies, of different communities coming in, like all of that fear versus living with love. That's how you get the policies that we have today.
Thanks. Yeah, I really appreciate you bringing in that framing that this issue doesn't exist in isolation and relates to all of these other structural factors that shape equal access to opportunity and a healthy life. I think that's really helpful.
Honestly, that was our plan for the ground game. So that's why we were thrown off. Because we're like, oh, we have a strategy, right? So like while they're coming to the midterms talking about abortion, we're going to also talk about voting rights. We're going to also talk about climate change. It's the same people. It's literally the same legislators. Like if you watch a congressional hearing or if you watch a state house, you will see the same people bringing up the same bills because they have the same frame. In the same way, you can go the other way. The people like me who are wanting to have more access to abortion also fight for voting rights. And so it makes sense that we just have different views. We have different worldviews. I don't care. People who work in our space, the difference is I don't care if all of them think like me. I just don't think they should be in charge, right? So like, I don't care if they go home and complain every day that people are running around having abortions and smoking weed and voting and going across the border. They can do all of that, but do they get to make the rules for everybody else? That is the question. So when I began this work and when MBEC started, when I would talk about anti-racism, people would say, you're not going to stop everybody from being racist. And they miss the point. This is not to change everybody's mind, but you don't need to get to be in control of the world if you are a racist, patriarchal, religious fundamentalist person. Like you then create policies that the majority of the world do not agree with. That's just, we've moved on from that worldview. And so there was a time that worldview was the dominant worldview, and it no longer is.
And I want to talk about this concept of criminalizing
Yes,
abortion, which of
yes.
course has always been a risk,
Yep,
but could potentially be a heightened risk
for
now
sure.
in this post-Dobbs landscape. So first, what does it mean to criminalize abortion? And then as a second part to that, how could the criminalization of abortion potentially impact people who experience other types of pregnancy loss, like stillbirth or
Yeah.
miscarriage? Can you talk through some of those kind of expansive consequences?
For sure, and I'll try to give concrete examples because it helps people to think about how it plays out. So my same friends in Texas who've never performed an abortion, who work just delivering babies, had to sign non-disclosure agreements with their employers, because their employers were basically saying, if you get in trouble, we're not support, like that's on you. Because the law says that they can be sued individually by anybody, right? So if a person comes in and has a miscarriage, and the boyfriend thinks that they had a termination, the boyfriend can sue that doctor for $10,000. So basically, the hospital associations are saying, we're not going to be responsible for all these lawsuits. So it became everybody being afraid of everyone, and no one wanted to take any new patients, and created a whole world of fear mongering, because now the providers are, who, especially if you've never, so when you were like me, if you've been doing abortion since in your 20s, you're like, whatever, they just always make stuff up and lie. So I don't think of it like they have not arrested anybody that I've seen. People have volunteered to be arrested and they still haven't. So it's the goal of all these laws is to scare you. I don't want them to go back to shooting doctors, but there was a time that was the hotness, right? They would shoot abortion doctors, and I've had FBI agents since I was in my 20s, because there was a real fear. I would show up places and old white dudes would stand there with signs yelling at me and screaming at me. So there is a desire, it creates a culture of fear. So the criminalization, even if you never actually arrest a human being, it's like the threat of knowing you have stop and frisk. You don't have to actually be stopped and frisked, but it's there, so you worry about it happening. If you are a provider or a patient and you live in a state that has criminalized abortion, you don't know what the rules really are, and they still don't. So it's still like all this, we don't know, because they can't decide what they want to do either. Like how are they going to really collect this $10,000? Who's paying the $10,000? Where's the bounty coming from if you claim you're so broke as a state? Like all of these, but it creates fear that keeps people at home and keeps people scared and makes people forced to have babies that they cannot afford to pay for, cannot afford to take care of. And then we blame and shame the mothers who we don't give paid leave, who don't have equal pay, who are still making $7.25 an hour. Like we blame them for our policy violence choices over and over and over and over again. So the criminalization is leading right now to more deaths, not necessarily to more people actually being incarcerated, but it is creating a culture of fear across the South and the Midwest. And it's creating people having to go. I mean, there was a 10-year-old who was raped, she had to go from Texas to another state to have a termination, and they threatened her parents. Like, how is that the correct social policy, to be mad at parents who are trying to make sure that their 10-year-old does not have a baby after being raped? Like, that's the kind of choices that we're making. And somehow, the legislators of Texas don't seem to see where that is antithetical to any kind of, even if you talk about religion, whatever frame that it is difficult to see what the good part of that is, making a 10-year-old have a baby. It's just very difficult to see.
Thank you. And I was actually going to ask about any particularly salient stories that you had, and I think that is a really, really powerful one. The next question I wanted to ask was how this discussion around abortion bans and the criminalization of abortion fits into the larger landscape of maternal and reproductive health for Black pregnant people and Black parents. And you've touched on this a little bit already, thinking about maternal mortality rates and racialized disparities in those rates. But can you talk through kind of how these things all fit together?
For sure. So we actually at MBEC wrote the first amicus brief detailing how abortion impacts maternal mortality. It was for the Dobbs case in Mississippi. And it was big because normally people don't talk about maternal mortality, but think about how often a pregnancy requires, like I mentioned, the person who, if you have a fetal anomaly or if you have something, and when I say a fetal anomaly, so if you're pregnant and you found out the baby doesn't have a fully formed brain and that the baby would not survive if it came out of your vagina. So we usually don't find that out till you're like 4 or 5 months pregnant. So that's a huge, you are pretty far along. We might not know, we're still watching it. We're trying to pay attention to see how it's going. And so that is something that we normally would offer you if you wish to terminate, because continuing to be pregnant, you're putting yourself at more and more risk of being pregnant, of getting a blood clot or having a heart attack because your blood is thicker when you're pregnant. Your heart has to work harder when you're pregnant, and you're carrying a fetus that will not survive, that will be born and not take a breath and live. And yet we're now saying to those moms, you must stay pregnant. right? Risk your own life to carry a baby that is going to be born and not live out. Mississippi, I have so many Mississippi stories. Mississippi got COVID money, and instead of using it to assist with any of this, they paid a bunch of money to a IT firm to create a system for adoption. This is how you know you're wrong. When you are preparing for modernizing adoption, because you know there's going to be a bunch of babies that are born that people can't pay for, and you're preparing for that they're going to need to be adopted. And you say this out loud, and they say the quiet part out loud, and then we look and say, do you hear yourselves? Like, you're willing to risk a person's life. You're willing to use $500,000. And $500,000 in Mississippi is a gazillion dollars. So you're using $500,000 on an IT thing to create a network for adoption in a state that has no water in Jackson people could use for months, right? Like the choices and the decisions are so deeply problematic and harmful and honestly hateful. And so it's hard for me to like look at them and not see hate, because they are not, this is not, because in Mississippi, this is not just black folks. Mississippi has a lot of poor white folks, a lot of poor white women who are dying, who don't have access to things, who don't have running water. Jackson is not 100% black. These communities are very poor and white and black, and we are spending $500,000 on an app for adoption. And so those kind of choices are deadly.
Yeah, and I think really speaks to how there is no social safety net set up for parents who are forced to carry a pregnancy to term. And if the actual goal is to encourage people to have children and to have a family, but then there's no support provided to actually care for that child. I think, yeah, like you said, it's saying the quiet part out loud.
It is, and what they are not accustomed to is an alliance between all of us. And so that was the other part. Like, normally we could make this be a black versus white conversation. Like, no, it's some poor white folks that are struggling in Mississippi, in Texas, in Alabama. We don't have the worst maternal health outcomes in the industrialized world only because of black and indigenous people. It's not enough of us. There are white women who are dying, who would not die if they lived somewhere else. So that means, and when I say 8 to 12 times in New York City, that's not because white, it's because white women in New York City are doing great. But the white women in Alabama, Texas, and Mississippi are struggling. They're just doing a little bit better than the black folks, right? And that's usually because some of the white women there actually have more resource. But a lot of them do not. When you don't invest in public education, when you don't invest in child care for generations, those things are not racialized. Like, there are a lot of people who are struggling across those states. So this is opportunity. So I'm also an optimist. I'm from the Deep South, and I just grew up around folks. I took ballet classes with people who are the Daughters of the Confederacy. Like, I'm clear. We are all just human beings, and when we realize how much we're all being screwed, we have a much bigger alliance,
Well, speaking of being an optimist, I do want to shift to thinking about solutions.
Yes.
So, I'd love to hear your perspective as a healthcare provider. What are solutions both to protect healthcare providers who are facing potential threats for providing healthcare,
Yep.
and what role can healthcare providers play in protecting abortion access and reproductive rights?
Well, I think the first step is us recognizing that the fear is the point, right? So, like, the fear mongering. So you see now a lot of my colleagues and allies stepping up and saying, okay, I sign me up, I did one, arrest me, and then nothing happens. So when that happens enough times, you say, okay, well, what we need protection from even being fear mongered. Like, stop with the little game playing. It's like the world is being run by a bunch of 12-year-old bros or something. Like, it's like, what are we doing here? So there was a time that I was very, very, and I still do believe we need strict policies. We need to have Congress needs to pass the law that makes abortion legal and does not deal with the Supreme Court. So for honestly, that part, and I know I sound flip about that, is a lower hanging fruit. Like, that will happen soon. But if we don't change how the culture believes and sees abortion, if we still make it like some back alley thing that people got to be afraid they're going to get shot, and then we'll always demonize it. We'll treat it, it's just healthcare. It's just a part. So the same way that a middle income or rich woman can go to her doctor and just say, hey, I don't want to be pregnant anymore, everybody should have that ability to do that. So the way that we become safe is really stop making it a closeted, secretive conversation. I have a friend who has an organization that talks about, it's called My Abortion Story. And I tell her all the time, I want more men to tell their abortion story. Plenty of them would not have their fancy jobs if they had not paid $325 for someone to have a termination. This is not just a girly conversation. So protecting us also means changing how we talk about it, how we think about it, not demonizing groups of people, but really changing the culture. It's like the countries that have better outcomes than us, they have much better sex ed. They have much. They talk about things like masturbation that we demonize that for Surgeon General. For like, so just thinking through how we could change both the policies, but also just our cultural belief around how abortion sits in our country and what sex is and what pleasure is. So we offered for a White House Office of Sexual Reproductive Health and Well-being under this administration, and really asking for it to not just sit at the White House, but across agencies to undo this harm of eugenics that our country was built upon, right? So as long as we're talking about family planning, I have lots of plans, but you don't sit around at 18 thinking about what you're going to do for the rest of your life when it comes to your reproductive life journey. And that's how we talk about reproduction right now, is that people sit around and plan out their journeys. And nobody's life really works like that. But if we really had a culture of sexual reproductive health, and not just health, but we added the word well-being and the word sex for two reasons. One, people don't just use their organs to reproduce. Sex is important. Pleasure is important. And it's not just about health, it's also our mental health, our emotional health, our spiritual health. So well-being, what would it look like to create a culture of sexual reproductive health and well-being? So my optimism is that will happen, if not under this administration, and within the next one.
And then lastly, to close us out, can you talk through potential solutions in thinking about the spectrum of reproductive health and maternal health? What are some of the resources and structures we need in place to protect maternal health, particularly for Black parents?
For sure. And I can give some examples. There's a friend of mine that has a clinic in Memphis called Choices, and she's a Black midwife. And in this clinic, it is in Memphis, which is the Deep South, in a state that we just saw what they did in Tennessee, so we know where she is. And yet she has a clinic that provides both deliveries and abortion. That is a model. What would it look like to have more birth centers that provide the full range of services in the community, provided by people who are from the community or who look like the people from the community? That is the future. So there's another project called the Birth Center Equity Project, and they have about 60 different organizations across the country wanting to open birth centers in communities and making sure that there are people from the community who participate and are part of that conversation. We have the Respectful Maternity Care work, which is looking at modernizing thinking through how hospitals take care of patients. For example, right now, if you have a harm done to you, it's kind of we love this quiet secret stuff. It's a lawsuit, and then we say we can't talk about it. And I know I'm talking to a bunch of lawyers, but as long as we keep it quiet, we don't have any structural change, right? So this has to be loud. And so with this, having a community board that actually works to review the cases and come up with policies with you. And we started that process with CDC, with the maternal mortality review committees, but thinking through how that can expand, not just for maternal mortality, but all the range of reproductive and sexual health. What does it look like for a community to have everything they need to meet all of their reproductive and sexual health? Gender nonconforming. So this is for everybody. This includes fathers. This includes everybody. And that language, we shopped that language around for about a year. And it really resonates with people that think through respectful maternity care and also sexual reproductive health and well-being. They can see themselves in that frame. And we can then, the Momnibus has included both of those items, all of those items in the Momnibus. And we've been fighting to get that. We're reintroducing the Momnibus again this year. And we're optimistic that a third time's a charm. But because there's no reason not to invest in mamas, right? Like that's just the excuses that we get are not yet, or we're used as a bargaining chip for other things, because this is how this city is made. This is how DC is made. But bargaining on the lives of mamas, it's time to end that. It's time to end that.
I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Dr.
Thank you.
Joia.